on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they wondered about this, two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. Jesus has risen." Church, Jesus has risen. Jesus has risen. It's Easter. And Easter is all about Jesus. Billions of people, literally billions of people across this planet are gathering to remember and celebrate Jesus. We like Jesus. Everybody likes Jesus. He's popular. Today you can find Jesus here. How does Jesus like and make his coffee? Well, he brews it. It's a little cheesy. You can find Jesus here. Hats, right? Bling. You can find Jesus here. You can find him on packs. Jesus has my back. It's kind of cute. You can even find Jesus here. Jesus kazoos. What do you do with Jesus today? He's popular. We like Jesus. He's everywhere. But here's the question on this Easter. As today we remember, as today we celebrate, Jesus is alive, Jesus is risen from the dead, Jesus is the Holy One. As we celebrate him, I have one question. Just one question for you to consider. And actually, it's not even my question. It's his. Matthew chapter 16 says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" See, people, they knew his name. Jesus' word was getting out. They had heard about some of the amazing things that this Jesus had done, but here's what Jesus was wondering. Well, who do they say that I am? Verse 14. They replied, well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Notice, those are all good. Those are among the greatest spiritual leaders in all of history up to that point. No one was saying, oh yeah, Jesus, that guy's a fraud. No one was saying, oh yeah, Jesus, that guy, he's a con artist. The general consensus was that Jesus was uniquely connected to God. And Jesus, well, he didn't stop there. Verse 15, but what about you, Jesus asked. Who do you say that I am? Notice the shift. First question, Jesus says, well, who do they say that I am? And now it's a different question. Jesus asks, well, what about you? Who do you say that I am? That's the question. That's the Easter question. Verse 15, but what about you? Jesus asked. Who do you say I am? See, Jesus, he's alive. He's risen from the dead, but he is still asking that question. And he's not just asking that question to the person on your right, and he's not just asking that question to the person on your left. He's asking that question to you. Here's his question, verse 15, but what about you? Jesus asked, who do you say I am? Jesus, well, he wasn't asking, well, what do you think about the rich? Do I like the music? Do I like the people? Do I like the vibe? That's not the question. That's not the Easter question. And Jesus wasn't asking, well, what do you think about Christians? Maybe you know a Christian who's wound just a little bit too tight. And if you're sitting right next to them, don't point at them right now. Maybe you know some Christians who are judgmental or hurtful or hypocritical. And that's unfortunate, but it does happen. But recognize, that's not the question. That's not the Easter question. This is, verse 15, but what about you, Jesus asked. Who do you say I am? See, Jesus, he isn't asking what you think about churches. He isn't asking what you think about Christians. He isn't asking what you think about worship services. He's asking what you think about him. What do you think about who this Jesus of Nazareth is? No pressure at the Ridge. You're not going to have to tell anyone. You're not going to have to stand up. You're not going to have to raise a hand. I just invite you to set aside whatever preconceived notions you have of Christians or of churches and simply consider the person of Jesus. Verse 15, but what about you, Jesus asked. Who do you say I am? Why are billions of people gathering and remembering this guy? Jesus of Nazareth. He never wrote a book, but more books have been written about him than anyone else in all of history. Jesus of Nazareth. He never ran for political office, but more people have chosen him as their leader than anyone else in all of history. Yale historian. Notice, Yale, not Christianity Today. This is Yale. Historian Ken LaTorre says this: as the centuries pass, the evidence is accumulating that, measured by his effect on history, Jesus is the most influential life ever lived on this planet. Let's dig into that. Consider the impact that Jesus has had on this little guy. Isn't he cute? I mean, today we see kids and babies and we think, oh, how precious, right? How adorable. They're valued. But understand, just because that's how we approach that, that's not the way it's always been. In the ancient world, children didn't have rights. Parents who, for any reason, didn't want their child, they could go outside the city, and there were designated places outside all the cities. You could just go there and you could just leave your kid, just abandon them. And what would happen is these kids, they would eventually die of exposure. That's the way the world was. You know, children, they were legally disposable. That's not the way it works today. Our world is different. Why? Jesus. Luke 18, verse 15. People were also bringing babies to Jesus for him to place his hands on them. Some people brought their babies to Jesus, wanting him to bless them. Well, look what happened. Verse 15 continues. When the disciples saw this, they rebuked them. They're saying, Jesus, they're babies. Babies aren't even people yet. Don't waste your time on them. Into a culture that legalized the exposure of young children, Jesus said these words that maybe they're familiar to us today, but they were stunning back then. Verse 16, Jesus called the children to him and said, let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Jesus, he was saying these kids, they're not disposable. He's saying these kids, they're important, they matter, they count. Well, the followers of Jesus, they heard this. They saw how he treated children. They began to pick up on this idea. And sometime after the resurrection, the followers of Jesus, they began to go to these designated exposure drop-offs outside of the cities and rescue the abandoned kids. Do you know what that is? That is how orphanages started. Right? It wasn't the government coming and say, hey, we got a problem. We've got these abandoned kids. It didn't happen that way. It wasn't some nonprofit that said, hey, we need to help these kids who are getting abandoned. No, it was the followers of Jesus who first cared for these children whose parents didn't or couldn't. The question of Easter, but what about you? Jesus asked. Who do you say I am? Well, Jesus didn't just change the world for children. There's also this. That's the Garden of Gethsemane. It's still there today. Several years ago, my wife Sarah and I, we were in Israel and we went to the Garden of Gethsemane. But when we got to the gate, they stopped my wife, wouldn't let Sarah in. Want to know why? Here's what they said. They said she was dressed too provocatively. Now, for you, those of you who know my wife Sarah, doesn't that just describe her? Yeah. I can't take her anywhere. Let me tell you what she was wearing. She had a dress on, and the dress, it covered her thighs, it covered her knees, it covered her calves, but she did show just a little bit of ankle. Sarah got busted at the Garden of Gethsemane for showing too much ankle. Do you know what I was wearing? Shorts. They let me right in. I guess me in shorts isn't provocative for anybody. I should probably be insulted by that. Double standard. If you think that there's sexism in the world today, imagine, just try and wrap your head around what it must have been like in the ancient times. Aristotle, who was kind of the leading thinker of those days, he articulated the common view this way. He said, the relation of male to female is by nature a relation of superior to inferior and ruler to ruled. Anybody want to start an Aristotle fan club? The correct answer is no. Right? Well, that's not the way it is today. Our world is different than that. What happened? What changed? Jesus. Luke chapter 10, verse 38. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. Jesus was at the home of two sisters, Mary and Martha. And Martha, she was doing what the culture expected a woman to do, preparing a meal, cooking food, cleaning the house. Well, Mary, she didn't do that. She went to listen to Jesus. Verse 39. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. To sit at someone's feet, that was the technical term meaning to be someone's disciple. You see this? Do you understand what was happening? Jesus was inviting women to be his disciples. That was unprecedented. No rabbi did that. None of the leaders in that day were doing that. Women, they began to find a new role, a new value in the community of Jesus' followers. And just look around at the world today. Where do you find the most valued, the most respected women in the world? Well, nations with Christian origins. Ladies, any of you want to live in Afghanistan? China? Any takers for Saudi Arabia? Look at history. The primary factor for our equality-based view of women is Jesus. It's Jesus. So Jesus, he changed the world for children. And Jesus, he changed the world for women. And he didn't stop there. Around 400 years BC, before Jesus actually was on this earth, there was a plague that swept through Athens. Greek historian Thucydides, he described the situation to us like this. They died with no one to look after them. Indeed, there were many houses in which all the inhabitants perished through lack of any intention for care. The bodies of the dying were heaped up, one on top of the other. They pushed the sufferers away and fled from their dearest, throwing them into the road before they were dead. Gruesome. Those days, if you got sick, you got quarantined. You know, there was no constitutional rights. And there were no teachings from the Greek gods to take care of the sick. But that's not the way it works today. Today the world's different. Why? What changed? Jesus. Luke chapter 5, verse 12. Well, Jesus was in one of the towns. A man came along who was covered with leprosy. So this guy, he's highly contagious leper. He gets close to Jesus. What does Jesus do? Does he run away? Does he put a hazmat suit on? Does he at bare minimum say, hey, back up just a minute here. Guy, I don't want to get what you've got. Well, no. Jesus didn't do that. He did this. Verse 13. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. If you're familiar with the Gospels, you know, that's not a surprise to you. I mean, Jesus, he's doing that kind of thing all the time, right? He's touching the lepers. He's hanging out with the people who are sick. Understand this. No one in that day did that. We're familiar with that because we've heard that for centuries. But when Jesus initially did that, it was unprecedented. It was dangerous. What he did was unheard of. When Jesus began doing this world, it began to change. The next time a plague struck, these followers of Jesus, they didn't abandon the sick. Rather, they took care of them. Caring for the sick and dying became so deeply embedded in the followers of Jesus that a couple centuries later, at the Council of Nicaea, the followers of Jesus made a decree. They said, wherever there is a church, there must also be a hospice, a place for caring for the sick. Do you know what that was? That was the beginning. That was the beginning of what today we call hospitals. Hospitals. Why? Where did those come from? Where did those start? Jesus. Jesus. Well, it's Easter. The question of Easter, Matthew 16, verse 15. But what about you? Jesus asked. Who do you say I am? Well, a philosopher by the name of Yaroslav Pelikan, he says this about Jesus. Regardless of what anyone may personally think or believe about him, Jesus of Nazareth has been the dominant figure in the history of Western culture for almost 20 centuries. Wow. Today, we like Jesus. Jesus is a nice guy. Jesus is a good guy. Jesus is a moral guy. Just one huge problem with that. This. Why would anyone hurt dear, sweet Jesus? Well, hear the transcript from his trial. Mark chapter 14, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy." And if you're not sold on the validity of the Bible, just look outside of the Bible. Roman history documents that Jesus of Nazareth was executed for insurrection and blasphemy, claiming to be God. Jesus of Nazareth clearly, emphatically, repeatedly, unapologetically claimed to be God. The Easter question: what do you do with Jesus? Who do you think he is? Today, Jesus is popular. You can find Jesus on a lot of stuff. You can find him on mugs and hats and packs and kazoos. You can even find Jesus socks. Check these bad boys out. I got my Jesus Easter socks on. And Jesus is riding a bicycle. Not sure that's historically accurate, but it's on there. You know, you ever wonder, how does that happen? How does that happen? How does a man who was 2,000 years ago executed as a common criminal on a cross, how does he have that kind of staying power? Typically, when a person dies, their influence on the world decreases. But Jesus, he inverted this normal pattern. Jesus' influence, it was greater 100 years after his death than it was during his life. And 1,000 years after his death, his life teachings laid the foundation for Western civilization. And today, nearly 2,000 years later, this Jesus has more followers in more places than ever. Who is this guy? How do you explain that? What happened? I'll tell you what happened. Easter happened. Luke 24. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly, 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. He has risen." And that changes everything. Jesus, once dead, now alive. Easter is this big deal across this planet. Well, why? Because that, once dead, now alive, that had never happened before, and it has never happened since. Give me the name of anyone in all of history who has died, but several days later came back to unending life. That changes things. If Easter is true, if Jesus of Nazareth was resurrected from the dead, then he's not just a wise teacher. Because there's a lot of wise teachers that have died, but they haven't risen from the dead. If Easter is true, if Jesus was raised from the dead, then Jesus isn't just a nice, good life coach. Because good life coaches, they don't rise from the dead. The question of Easter, Matthew 16, verse 15, "But what about you?" Jesus asked. "Who do you say I am?" Historian H.G. Wells said this. Here was his answer. "I must confess, as a historian, that this penniless preacher from Nazareth is irrevocably the very center of history. Jesus is easily the most dominant figure in all history. But what about you? Jesus asked. Who do you say I am? I'll tell you what I say. I believe that Jesus is who he said he is. I believe that Jesus is God become man. I believe that Jesus came to this earth and that he willingly sacrificed his life on that cross for the forgiveness of sins. I believe that he died, but that he didn't stay that way. I believe in the third day. I believe in the resurrection. I believe he's alive. I believe in Easter. I believe that death isn't the end. Not for Jesus, not for you, not for me, not for those we love. That's a very hopeful thought on a day like today. Death isn't the end for those that we know and love. I believe that no matter who you are, no matter what you've done, no matter what you're doing, God, he made you and he still loves you and he hasn't given up on you. And Jesus has the authority to forgive you. And I believe that Jesus has power to get you through whatever challenge you're facing today. That he has the power to get you out of that habit. That he has the power to get you over whatever that hurt or pain is. I believe that Jesus has the power to set you free and to give you peace. That's me. But that's not his question. Matthew 16:15. But what about you? Jesus asked. Who do you say I am? It's Easter. Jesus isn't asking you what you think about church, and he's not asking you what you think about a worship service. He's not asking you what you think about Christians. He's asking, what do you think about him? How do you explain the impact of Jesus of Nazareth on history? How do you explain his claims to be God? How do you explain the events of Easter? Who do you say that he is?